So I think that, what everybody's touched upon is what I'm going to kind of wrap up with. And just a little bit about allows us the Palestine Right to Return Coalition, and it's great that, that's how I'm introduced. But as a natural consequence of being an activist or a community organizer with the Arab community, predominantly Muslim, and certainly around Palestinian issues, my work tends to naturally evolve in and out of al-Awda and onto Muslim community defense, depending on the circumstance. I'd like to pick up a little bit where a lot of people kind of left off, and I personally don't like the term Islamophobia. It seems like some type of contagious disease that is uncontrollable. And it certainly is what we're seeing happen to the Muslim community, whether it's the surveillance or the predatory prosecutions, is certainly a form of anti-Muslim racism, but it's an attack on those communities because of their political identity, which is also tied to the ethnic and religious identity. So it's not the fact that you're a Muslim and you believe, in God in the way that you do, but the fact that as a Muslim, you believe in the liberation of Palestine, you believe in self-determination and liberation of the Muslim people and their rights to their own resources and against imperialism. So when the Bureau of Prisons handbook says that, a CO needs to teach, has to make sure that there's no political conversations and needs to teach about needs to teach a Muslim inmate about mainstream Islam. There's an agenda, and it's all tied to the political identity which is associated with the religious belief or the ethnic identity. And so when we talk about, the federal courts have long authorized selective prosecution, and they have authorized the executive, right, which runs all law enforcement, to engage in selective sorts of prosecution as when they relate to the implementation and furtherance of foreign policy domestically, right? So when in the 70s, Nixon launched the operation that Deepa referred to, it was tied to the Arab general uprising and resistance to Israeli expansionism and wars, and activism in the U.S. in support of Palestinian resistance to Israeli expansionism. And very overtly, the policy was target those people involved in pro-Palestinian activities, and the federal court said that's absolutely okay and authorized. And it's great that everybody's been bringing up the Japanese internment, but the internment, by the way, was predated by exactly what we're seeing happen to the Muslim community across the U.S. It began with all of these raids. It began with this concerted movement even before the bombing of Pearl Harbor. So this is the typical trend of imperial expansionism and making sure that dissent, in whatever form it comes from, whatever community it comes from, is absolutely quashed. So when we look at post 9/11, the first images that we saw from the Arab world or the Muslim world reaction were doctored images of Palestinians, doctored images, later admitted to be doctored images of Palestinians celebrating in the street. And the first response after the massive roundup, and I was at 26 Federal Plaza and felt like I was back at an Israeli checkpoint in the 80s before even Oslo, it was so terrible, right? The first line of attack was against all Palestinian institutions that had been built up over the past 3 decades. They were immediately dismantled. They were the first line of attack. And we saw entire Palestinian communities, especially in the Northeast, washed out, right? And that was also the first line of attack in the entrapment cases. And we saw a lot of the expert witnesses that were posed as the government's witnesses on many of these cases, whether the case was focusing on Palestine or some type of support to Palestine or not, were expert witnesses, right, who have long relationships with the Israeli regime, with plenty of Zionist think tanks, right? These are people who are employed by a foreign power, right, directly and indirectly, and that's still the case. Matthew Levitt is a prime example of that. And so it's important to understand that certainly it is racism, but it's racism that's fomented to further imperialism, to further war across the Arab and the Muslim world. And we look at, post 9/11, the Sheikh was absolutely right, that we didn't see the type of backlash that we're seeing now. I've been, an activist and a defender in the Muslim community, even before I graduated law school. Then I graduated in 2003. So I've been at the front lines of kind of seeing everything that's really happening, especially as an activist in a neighborhood that's, a hotspot, high priority target, full of working class and very active, at least vocal, Arab Muslims. What we saw 2003 to 2004 or 5, I thought at that time was the climax. I mean, we were in constant emergency mode, responding to whether it was investigations or, police brutality or what have you. But that wasn't the case, because it resurged again in 2008, worse than it was post 9/11. Worse, 2004 was really the height of post 9/11, law enforcement repression. That was outdone by 2008. And in fact, right after Obama was elected, I had, a ridiculous amount of clients and friends picked up, detained, and interrogated specifically on what they thought the Obama elections would do, and what type of response the people in their country would have. I kid you not. It was the most ridiculous thing. And, building up on this, defamation, racism, right? Racism, defamatory racism, defamation, racism in speak, in language, is really the most sinister thing that we have, because it's from this that we're able to normalize. And as Deepa touched, on the issue, anti-Muslim, anti-Arab racism is not new. It's not post 9/11. If you look at the Bugs Bunny cartoons and you see the images of the pot-bellied sultan running around, trying to rape the women and kill everybody, otherwise he's fat and lazy, this has long predated 9/11, and it comes from, the Orientalist agenda of studying and controlling, right, the Arab Muslim world, and then resurged again in the 70s, in fact, and the government knows it's effective, and in fact the government, the Department of Defense itself, funds movies where Muslims are killed, by these heroic, Marines, and the audience gets up and claps, right? It's very effective. And it's very effective in creating a society that attacks, right, this population, right, because of their religious identity, when in fact it's because of the political identity, right? But it also allows or makes the subjects themselves internalize, self-police, and stop defending. One of the cases, I've done, some of the material support defense work, but I took on the case of defending the Sheep's Head Bay Mosque, which came under attack at the time when, this cocktail of groups and parties had been involved in trying to shut down the mosques. And what was really interesting was that the plaintiffs, who were the racists saying this mosque does not belong in this neighborhood, before coming to court, had drafted and sent out to every civil society institution and local government official letters saying, these Muslim radicals, this is going to be a place for, it's not going to be a house of worship, it's going to be a place for militant recruitment, these are terrorists who danced and celebrated on 9/11, our Constitution doesn't know how to deal with this. And across the board, right, whether it was NYPD, the fire department, local governance, whoever it was, the response was, don't worry, we're going to investigate them, okay? And that's exactly what happened. Right? All of a sudden, not all of a sudden, I mean, they've been long investigated. After all, they're part of building the mosque. But you have more undercovers hanging out in a car, all the sinister things that you would normally have. Worse over, the people, the builders involved in building the mosque really bought into what they were being told. And what they were being told by these same departments and these same officials was, listen, it's a very controversial subject. We're going to let you build most perfect building permits in the history of building permits, because they knew it had to be, right? We're going to let you build, we're going to give you these permits if you just don't make a big deal about it. right? And so they internalized this, and they said, okay, you're right, we're not going to complain. We're going to deal with the complaints. We're going to have all the work stop, and spend umpteen, tens of thousands of dollars, because they've internalized that they need to be on their best behavior to be given what they're owed by the law, right? And then this, of course, played out in the plaintiff's filings in court, which were outrageous, quotes in legal pleadings, which happens on other matters that I deal with that involve, Arabs or Muslims, by the way. But, here, it's a high-profile case, relatively at the time. Stuff like, the attorney saying, the defendants clearly don't understand the constitutional rights of free speech for which they must be grateful by living in the United States. Most of them are citizens, right? This is not Iran or Iraq, right? A country where we do not. Just replete with racism that he wasn't even aware was racist to put in pleadings, right? And so it's effective, but it was effective for a long time, and it wasn't until they had to go to court where they realized, oh shit, we've been, excuse my language, oh my God, we're being taped, that this is wrong. Sorry about that. That this is wrong, right? So it's effective, right? It really does have a way of getting people to be quiet because it's terrifying, and what we're seeing happen through the NYPD, and it's important to note that the NYPD program was set up by the CIA, but it was modeled after, and most certainly in coordination with, the Israeli programs of monitoring and tracing Palestinians in even what this government calls occupied Palestinian territories, an illegal occupation. That's very sinister. So we're employing the same tactics on our own citizens that is employed by foreign occupying power. Right? That's terrifying stuff. Add to that the fact that you all know that it's elementary schools, right? I saw the actual leaked documents. And, I was allowed to see them because I had known so many of the people that were listed as top and high priority targets because they were activists, right? Many of them were Arab. And the ones that were really targeted in the Arab Muslim community were, first of all, the Arab Muslim mosques and schools that were high priority were Palestinian run, okay, and started, and the majority were Palestinian students. And in fact, they have quotes from people about what they're saying about their sympathy with the Palestinian struggle in the NYPD summary reports. And this is just a master report, so you can imagine what's being said. So it's absolutely, this concern about dissent, right? And it was we'll get to the Farhani case. But so in that context, we have the Farhani case now, right? Ahmed Farhani. The undercover, there were two undercovers that were sent to target this one Palestinian organization. The undercover cop, this formal undercover officer, spent years trying to get an arrest, right? And there were tons of reports from the NYPD saying that, they didn't find him credible, and in fact, he was being investigated at some point by the FBI, this undercover NYPD agent. But his case, we have good reason to believe, comes directly out of the demographics unit, right? He's going around, the undercover's going around from mosque to organizations to all of the MSAs, right, that were all involved. Spent years doing this, couldn't come up with anything. And lo and behold, he catches Ahmed Farhani, who's mentally ill. And in fact, he's so mentally ill that the NYPD themselves institutionalized him over the course of 11 years. And when this agent came to target him, he had just been released from prison getting, psychological help through the Department of Corrections themselves, right? So perfect target, right? And this undercover started working kind of toward this entrapment case, not sure who the victim, who the next dummy was going to be, right? And he was planted right around the time of the Operation Kasla, the war on Gaza, right? Right around that time, boom, he's in there. Because the movement had come back, right? Palestinians and Arabs were back on the streets in a way that they hadn't been back since 9/11, right? And it was also no coincidence that around that same time, that's when NYPD really let loose on the demonstrators, right? We had a massive, massive stampede. We had kids, women that were maced and beaten up by the police at the last massive rally we had against the attacks, the Israeli attacks on Palestine, and at the same time that Patterson was joining the pro-Israeli rally, I don't know for what they were rallying, which only had a couple of hundred people. So it's not a coincidence that a lot of this, relates to our foreign policy interests, right? And is funded by the same foreign bodies, right? And what we're seeing, this resurgence now, I think, is in response to what is a growing anti-imperial perspective vis-a-vis Palestine and a growing disillusion with the war in Iraq and a lot of the anti-war mobilizations that is happening. There's no question that this is a monopoly on 9/11 and the targeting of Muslims, and then you have this marriage of all of these, who once would be strange bedfellows, right? A lot of these right-wing Tea Party types, hate Jewish people, but they're willing to collaborate and have this vast network of Zionist, pro-Israeli, Israeli-funded, groups coming together and putting a lot of money. And I'm sure that we'll find sooner, if not later, that a lot of this is coming through outside funding and going into the all this party stuff. There's a lot that I missed out on, but I'd like to say, so I'm an officer in the National Lawyers Guild New York chapter by circumstance, because this is where we kind of had to be to build and kind of bridge the gap between the non-Arab, non-Muslim legal community, the activists and organizers, and the Muslim leadership. When we started the Muslim Defense Project, which is doing a lot of work around these issues on a grassroots level and community empowerment stuff. And I'd like, I'm sorry, I know I need to wrap up. I would suggest that moving forward, we understand that the same exact practices that are being used against Muslims right now are also being used against, for example, the more mainstream, the Occupy Wall Street folks, right? They're being targeted, and the same infiltrators, there are drones flying over the OWS encampments right now, surveilling them, yes, mini drones they call them. And so it's important to look at this as to the direction that the country is taking as a whole. It's terrifying, really. Certainly as we see, the closing up of the 1% and their fear from the reaction of the masses who are affected by this economy, and really exposing and normalizing, dialogue around the Israeli role in all of this. AIPAC's role in circumscribing our constitutional liberties. We have to talk about this openly, and it's good to see that Muslim organizations that may not have historically been willing to engage because it's such a controversial subject are saying, okay, this relates to our political identity as it relates to the Palestinian struggle. Very critical. And we can't undermine or minimize the importance of Palestine to imperial expansion. Militarily, it is the most strategic part, in fact, right? It sits Africa, Asia, Europe, right there. Trade routes, right? That's why there's a world war that's playing out through the Egyptian Revolution. It's very, very critical. And so what happens, what happens here, it ties very much to the growing international movement in support of Palestine. And please, we need support for the Farhani case. Right now, I think May 15th is our next date, but we really need people to talk about this. I'm sorry, my last point is, yes, decisions come from the courts, but the courts are comprised of judges who are people, and these people are responsive only to the political atmosphere. Right now, the political atmosphere is worse than it was post 9/11. Until and unless we have people really mobilizing on the streets, on their campuses, campus mobilization is very critical to influencing, in my opinion, what happens in the judiciary, right? If we don't have a new political atmosphere created, we're not ever going to get a judicial decision that says that what's happening is wrong and effectively protects our constitutional right to dissent, because this is what it's all about, to dissent. So thank you. That's it.